afternoon, everyone, and especially you, Tom Holert. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Isabel, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be moderating this session. I will very briefly introduce Professor Holert, who is visiting us from the Harun Farocki Institute from Berlin. His talk today is titled Architectures of Human Capital on the Theory, Planning, Design, Usage, and Contestation of the Built Environments of University Reform in the 1960s and the 1970s. And as you all know, this is part of a broader seminar on universities, networks, and identities, a seminar that in 2022 as a topic, the topic of reforms. Tom Holert specializes on the politics of the visual and the histories of subjecthood in art and architecture. He holds a PhD from the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt, and he is co-founder of the Harun Farocki Institute in Berlin, and is currently visiting professor at the Hamburg University of Fine Arts. Professor Holert organized exhibitions such as Neolithic Childhood, Art in a False Present, circa 1930, with Anselm Franca, and Education Shock, Learning, Politics, and Architecture in the 1960s and the 1970s. I'm just going to read a few of his most recent titles. So his recent publications include Knowledge Beside Itself, Contemporary Arts, Epistemic Politics in 2020, Politics of Learning, Politics of Space, Architecture, and the Education Shock of the 1960s and the 1970s, published in 2021. And the last one, already published in 2022, I translated into from the German title to English, I hope that not incorrectly, titled Circa 1922, Violence, Environment, Identity, and Method. So again, welcome, Professor Holert, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luis. And the book that you mentioned towards the end is not yet published.
Okay. But it has a very intriguing title, so I'll be very curious.
It is in the layout right now, and we're hoping to have it from the printer in this year. It's called Circa 1972. So I will share my screen. Sorry. Do you see everything right? Good.
Yes.
So yes, many thanks for this kind and certainly. And certainly undeserved introduction, and even more so for the invitation to speak in the context of this seminar, the title and emphasis of which, Universities, Networks, and Identities Reforms, has proved to be greatly generative to me. In particular, the term reform, or rather its plural, reforms, which, if I understand correctly, is at the center of this year's procedures, has made me reconsider and at points revise some of the basic assumptions of my work on the intersection of educational and architectural histories in the second half of the 20th century. I also want to say that upon learning that Miguel Bandera Geronimo would be the respondent today, I somewhat refocused my original plan to dwell mostly on Western European cases and instead place a certain emphasis on developments in Africa, in Nigeria and the Congo, especially keeping in mind what the Nigerian educational scientist Payo Banya, longtime professor at the Institute of Education at the University of Ibadan, in 1999 put into a broad categorization of Africa's educational reform efforts, showing the patterns of first radical revolutionary, second realistic revolutionary, third evolutionary, and fourth ad hoc approaches, a list that could, I'd argue, without much adaptation be applied to other geographies as well. The question of reforms, and I would like to stress that it is really a question or a problem forever waiting to be answered and resolved, because every reform effort is eventually and maybe essentially faced with the disappointment and disillusionment of those who supported and lived it, in a certain perspective, and particularly during the 2 decades that interest me most, tends to be met with gestures of refutation, if not disgust. Even though the educational reforms put on the way in the 1960s and 1970s by agencies of the state all over the world and the commissions and councils formed to research, advise, draft and implement them have been endlessly varied and often contradictory, they failed and probably had to fail because they never could reach the radicality of revolutionary disruption and overhaul, but could at the same time, by their conservative and reactionary opponents, be accused of excess. The multiple reforms of university and higher education in the decades after the Second World War have been a cause of endless debate and struggle that arguably culminated in the upheavals of 1968. Of course, as we all know, these debates and struggles preceded the mythic 68 by many years, and they continued after 68 again for many years, with occasional outbreaks until the present day. From the vantage point of the year 2022, the university has been, of course, once again ripe for reform, a reform that would heal the wounds afflicted by neoliberal reform, regardless from where you speak within, for example, the territory of the EU and many countries at its periphery. The damage done by the excesses of neoliberal reform are manifest in many outcomes of the Bologna process and the Lisbon strategy. The marketization, over-administration, commodification, managerialization, precarization, modularization, etc. of higher education has solicited protests, strikes, occupations in universities all over the place between 2008 and 2011 and repeatedly ever since. But the frustration and the anger aren't limited to the domain of the Bologna process. They are a global phenomenon. Sorry. They are a global phenomenon. Since Bill Redding's 1997, The University in Ruins, a study on the corresponding demises of the nation state and the university as one of the nation state's eminent building stones, a rhetoric established that takes for granted the derelict state of the institution, its phantom-like, haunting condition. The title of a recent article on the bogus technological fixes and other innovations introduced to save the university in the Chronicle of Higher Education was riffing on the same metaphor. David Clark, a Canadian humanities professor, writes in an article titled "Abolish the University, Build the Sanctuary Campus," I quote, "Simply put, universities are facing unprecedented levels of agonized distress. Anxious and dispirited students, precariously employed faculty, and overworked and under-resourced staff all make for a disillusioned and disillusioning mess. Manifestly unjust structures of oppression that thrum through society also mar campus life. As far as concerns about unfairness and exhaustion are concerned, students, staff, and faculty work in a city without walls. Racialized exclusion, the looming climate catastrophe, and debilitating levels of indebtedness threaten even the most resourceful and committed students, of which there are very many. The pandemic conditions have only made these fractures and open wounds more legible. There's so much going on that is unnecessarily hurtful and unhealthful on campus, just below or just at the surface of universities that otherwise spend so much time and energy broadcasting messages of success, innovation, achievement, resilience, and excellence." End of quote. The despair and the anger of these words resonate with myriad other statements of complaint and criticism, with studies of the burden that academia has become for almost everyone working and studying here. Thus, the past years have witnessed a steep increase of contributions and voices advocating not only the critical study of the university's economy and financialization of academic capitalism, as well as of the university's racial and patriarchal origins and heritage, but the abolition of the university as such, thus calling for revolution rather than reform. The organizers of a conference at Duke University in October 2019 made it very clear that they, quote, "think it's time to take up an abolitionist approach to the university. Abolition," they go on, "we believe offers the occasion for thinking about the university in ways that the institution itself might otherwise render impossible. And in doing so, it may provide an opportunity to trouble the institution as we know and inhabit it, and as it inhabits us. Inspired by radical scholars and organizers in and outside of universities, we embrace abolition as a generative rather than merely negative project. We aim to build relations that steal that sheen from the university's romanticized history and to repurpose its resources, capacities, and function of reproducing sociality with and for other ways of being, other ways of living. And coming together, we take up the question, what would an abolitionist approach to the university say yes to? End of quote. In the following, I partly plan to elaborate on David Clarke's notion of the campus as sanctuary and his phrase of the university as a city without walls. Similarly, I want to take seriously the organizers of the Duke Conference on Abolition University Studies' aim to trouble how the institution is inhabited and how it inhabits us. These spatial metaphors invite us to attend to the spatial politics of abolitionist critique and furthermore to the spatial dimensions of the contemporary crisis of the university. Indirectly, they point to the kind of architectures and infrastructures among which the governance architectures of higher education loom particularly large, which the accumulated reforms that resulted in the contemporary crisis have brought about. Spatialities to be dismantled or repurposed, to be evacuated or at least inhabited differently. This attention to the spatiality of revolutionary politics in the ruins of educational reform, however, shall be redirected via a return to a time when the physical and governmental manifestations of reformist ambition and effort were particularly abundant. The time in question is the time of a historically exceptional expansion of education in general and of tertiary education, the university and other types of higher education institutions in particular, the 15 to 20 years from the late 1950s to the late 1970s, early 1980s, although today I will focus mostly on the 1960s. This was also an era in which the old idea of the university, be it informed by German idealism and the Humboldtian model by British religious liberals such as Matthew Arnold or John Henry Newman or the American pragmatist reformer John Dewey, went through a deep crisis only to be rediscovered and appropriated by young faculty and students as a counterpoint to the technocratic version of the university that they were forced to inhabit. As you know, Isabel Ferreira da Mota approached me on the background of my curatorial and research endeavors of the past 6 years or so, which centered on the relationship between education, politics, and the production of space, of architectures and infrastructures of learning, teaching, and knowledge production in the global 1960s and 1970s. Although I'm neither an architectural nor an educational historian, as I'd rather place myself in the field of contemporary art and visual cultures, I felt drawn to this historical era and the eminent importance that education knowledge production more generally gained throughout these years. The reasons for this conjuncture were manifold, and I will touch on some of them later on. However, what really tickled me was the ways in which educational policies and economics, urban and social planning, curricular innovation and pedagogical experimentation, development in architectural design and engineering, the frameworks of the Cold War and of decolonization on a global scale, the emergence of social movements and countercultures, that they were all deeply interspersed with numerous competing agendas and programmatics, many of them technocratic, and in the interest of enlarging the power and influence of ideological formations such as either Western-type liberalism, state socialism, or revolutionary nationalism, but some also subversive and to a certain extent abolitionist in intent. The main project yielded in the exhibition Education Shock, as here's the website of the HKW, and the Education Shock, Learning, Architecture and Politics in the 1960s and 1970s at House of World Cultures in Berlin in 2021. It was originally scheduled for 2020, but due to the pandemic it had to be postponed. with 2 accompanying publications, an extensive educational program involving schools in both former and western and eastern parts of Berlin, a conference, and a curated series of film screenings. Here you see the 2 books that were published at the occasion of this project. I would like to show some images of this exhibition just to give you an idea. Like the overall project, the Berlin exhibition was a decidedly international and collaborative endeavor, a collection of condensed presentations of often long-year research projects on a plethora of aspects of educational planning, architecture, infrastructure, with examples stemming from Guinea-Bissau, Ghana and Nigeria, the Canadian Arctic, Italy, France, the USA, the GDR, the Soviet Union, Cuba, Brazil, India, Iran, Yugoslavia, West Germany, and elsewhere, and a range of topics such as the Cold War science race between the Soviet Union and the United States, issues such as racism, segregation, colonialism, migration, disability, as well as the production of an international discourse on education and educational facilities in the publishing world on the level of the UNESCO, of that of research institutes that were founded to assess and develop the educational sector as a practice of spatial production to meet the needs of educational administrations that were under constant duress in the face of an exponentially rising number of students to be educated in order to satisfy the demands of the economy that burgeoned almost relentlessly, at least in the global north, until the crisis hit around 1973, the year of the first petrol shock in the aftermath of the end of the Bretton Woods regime. So yeah, a few other images from the exhibition in Berlin at HKW. A first itinerary of this long-term project was the exhibition Learning Laboratories in Utrecht in 2016-17, which allowed me in preparing and rehearsing and in a way testing the upcoming larger Berlin show to experiment with the various subjects of my own research and those of my collaborators, architectural and educational scholars, as well as visual artists, in the spatial setting of a small exhibition venue where we placed case studies and archival matter that pertain to selected aspects of mainstream, as well as radical theories and practices of methodologies and epistemologies of education, architecture, instructional technology, and politics. The case studies included a model project of educational television in the Ivory Coast in the 1970s, a typical example of the development through modernization approach in post-independence Africa, conceived, funded, and evaluated by institutions such as the World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF, the European Fund, and the governments of France, West Germany, and Canada, targeting an audience of primary and secondary school students, adults who were illiterate or school dropouts from rural areas. The compound of studios, classrooms, and dormitories where the educational program was produced and tested on students living on campus gained a lot of international attention. The distant learning endeavor of which it was a part was to be seen as a technological reconfiguration of spaces of learning to be rehearsed and modeled in the laboratory of decolonized Africa, and it was met with a good dose of skepticism by some people in Bouaké who recognized the neo-colonial character of the donor nations and organizations' grasp on the development of human capital on the continent. In 1964, Gary S. Becker, an economist from Chicago, at the time teaching and researching at Columbia University in New York, and a future Nobel Prize laureate, published Human Capital, a theoretical and empirical analysis with special reference to education, probably his best known book. Becker had started to work on the project in 1957, mentored by Theodore W. Schultz, another Chicago economist who pioneered the study of educational economics. Before, Becker had devoted his PhD thesis on the economic effects of racial discrimination. In the introduction to Human Capital, Becker elaborates that his, I quote, study is concerned with activities that influence future monetary and psychic income by increasing the resources in people. These activities are called investments in human capital. The many forms of such investments include schooling, on-the-job training, medical care, migration, and searching for information about prices and incomes. They differ in their effects on earnings and consumption, in the amounts typically invested, in the size of returns, and in the extent to which the connection between investment and return is perceived. But all these investments improve skills, knowledge, or health, and thereby raise money or psychic incomes. End of quote. This correlation of the level of education and well-being in a person on her or his financial and psychic position and economic value made it possible to conceive of the individual, but also of larger groups and even populations as opportunities of investment. A year after the publication of Becker's book, a West Berlin educational politician of the Social Democrats put it in these words. I quote, "What we invest today in education and training that will prove successful tomorrow in mature, responsible, mündige citizen and economic growth." End of quote. In the optimistic, welfare liberal scenario, investments in education would be formative democratically while securing a future of economic well-being. The Vitruvian man modular-like figure drawn on the cover of the first edition of Becker's book could serve as the visual rendition of the very subject to be shaped by a deliberate politics of human capital investments. However, the external influence on the individual needs to meet with a degree of self-awareness that one's own chances on the employment market, one's employability, depends on a readiness to invest in one's own education, knowledgeability, skills, personal development, etc. The figure is thus an abstract rendition of a new type of knowledge citizen to be produced by the institutions of education for the alleged benefit of the individual and the much more desired, expected benefit of a national economy's thriving. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, this conception, derived from a behaviorist anthropological subset of economics, wasn't at all limited to the global north and its first world educational environments. It may even be argued that one of its main areas of application was the global south, and in particular the post-independence schemes of modernization and progress, often informed, if not governed, by Western developmental theories. The final report of the first conference of African states on the development of education in Africa, that took place in Addis Ababa in May 1961, is one of those early documents of the impact that the theory of human capital was having, or at least was supposed to have, on the continent. It spoke of the, quote, enormous transformation, end of quote, in the swift post-independence movement away from, quote, traditional ways of living toward 20th century industrialism. The post-colonial societies are seen as being launched on a long course of modernization, spurred onward by the worldwide revolution of rising aspirations, yearning to throw off external direction, economic backwardness, illiteracy, and disease. Among the key measures to be taken in terms of modernization and industrialization also featured was the task to build systems of education geared to rapidly changing needs. And here, facing the issue of human capital appears to be unavoidable, an almost natural fact. For the report goes on by saying, I quote, "The modernizing society requires internal saving and productive investment, and in most cases it requires foreign capital as well. Above all, it must have highly trained people, and the more rapidly it modernizes, the greater is its need for high-level manpower. The concern of this conference is with investments in man, with upgrading people at all levels, or to use the terms of the economists, with the process of human capital formation. Thus, the training of teachers, who are in effect the seed corn for the development of a society's human resources, is considered tantamount. Education requiring the longest lead time, presenting the most difficult yet most vital problems in the programming of a nation's future." To translate these policy demands of the development of a society's human resources into the language of urban architectural planning and form, one may have a look at both the pre-independence and the post-independence attempts at finding a physical, spatial expression or complement of the theory of human capital even before it became codified in official policy language such as the Addis Ababa Report. In the former colonies, such as Ghana or Nigeria, the facilities of higher education were designed by European architects and built by European contractors. Here you can see, by way of example, the Technological College in Kumasi in Ghana, designed by Cubitt Scott and partners, and a dormitory structure on the campus of the University of Ibadan, designed by Matthew Fry and Jane Drew, all British architects. These architects based their practice on ideas about the colonial subject, the modelings and working hypotheses about the colonial constituencies they were meant to design a building for. In this particular case, the student population, were ambivalent, if not outright problematic. As Tim Livesey, the leading specialist on the built educational environment in colonial and post-colonial Nigeria, remarks about the image on which Western modernists such as Fry and Drew based their designs for the University of Ibadan's, Nigeria's first university, I quote, "The architects understood themselves as agents of a development that would supplant indigenous African cultures. Drew believed that Africa was shifting to, quote, a loose westernized pattern, perhaps more like that of California than Europe. Universities were understood to drive and express this transformation. Their plans for the university reflected the architect's conception of Nigerian university students as modern individuals who were shedding tribal ideas." In the 1950s, late colonial Nigeria, the issue of student everyday life at the University of Ibadan and other Nigerian universities had a particular significance as the forging ground for a new elite, Livesey points out. Students' behavior was scrutinized, imitated, and criticized. Student residence in modern buildings such as the resident hall at UCI, which you see here, wasn't undisputed. However, it was also considered by students and Nigerian and British university administrators as a legitimate aspect of students' elite self-perception, particularly as the campus constructions were understood to be decidedly modern and therefore in a safe cultural, not only geographical distance from the rougher, undeveloped parts of the city of Ibadan, which was deemed stubbornly traditional. This distance between city and university, between town and gown, however, was also seen as being problematic. Even some British advisors started to agree that colonial universities were too detached from their societies, Livesey writes. In 1957, Inter-University Council visitation recommended doubling Ibadan student numbers over 5 years. UCI was told to urgently reconsider its policy on student residence. The report suggested students share rooms, live in the temporary side huts or in Ibadan city itself. This said, debates about university residence were not specific to Nigeria, but as Livesey puts it, part of a transnational discourse re-evaluating student residence that was further energized by decolonization politics. Even before human capital theory and development theory actually merged in the early stages of decolonization and post-independence nation building, the social dimension of student life was arguably observed and evaluated as being about developing talent and its application to assure sufficient participation in higher education to satisfy labor market demand. The role that architectural design and planning, as well as the actual use of their results, the material buildings and infrastructures, played in the subsequent post-independence implementation of developmental and as well as specifically post- and anti-colonial concepts of education and educational economics is somewhat difficult to determine. In Nigeria, the University of Ibadan was to be complemented by the first university campus to be conceived after the transition from British rule in 1960, the University of Ife, today known as Obafemi Awolowo University. The new government commissioned the Israeli architect Aryeh Sharon, who worked for and with the construction company AMY. The new campus, intended to be an architectural rejection of British colonialism, was built between the early 1960s and the 70s and has been and continues to be the subject of a lot of praise. In the 1960s, In the 1960s, a brochure celebrated this as the most beautiful campus in Africa. A few years ago, the architect Swiefra adapted this claim for his documentary film on the university's architecture. Sharon, a former student at the Bauhaus, adapted modernist and brutalist idioms to the local Yoruba culture and offered his own revision of British tropical architecture to create an ensemble of climatically sustainable open structures and flowing spaces, blurring the habitual boundaries between interior and exterior formal and informal spaces. A photograph from the early 1970s, probably made by the American photojournalist and fashion photographer Elliot Elizophon, who traveled in West Africa in 1970-1972, shows a student in the outdoor stayway of the educational faculty. I would propose to read this image as a more concrete picture of this subject of human capital theory than the one from the cover of Gary Becker's book. The portrait of a future teacher, probably, arguably, or educator, a bearer of developmental projections, a pedagogical worker, an individual with personal, professional, economic, and social aspirations, framed by the brutalist, tropicalist structural beams of an architecture that weighs on the figure, but may also lift it up to realize in him and for Nigerian society what the university environment is believed to be capable of enabling. Another photograph, maybe also by Elizophon, depicting three male students in sport dresses moving up the ramp leading to the University of Ife's Hezekiah Oluwazani library from the early 1970s, recently has gained almost iconic status. It was used for the International Bauhaus Imaginista project in 2018-19, as well as for the cover of the long-awaited 2022 collection Radical Pedagogies, a book on avant-gardist architectural education and practice in the 1960s and 1970s. And there's a lot of evidence from the oral history of alumni and former and current faculty that the architecture actually entailed that it allowed something to happen that might be dubbed radical pedagogy, or at least nourish an atmosphere of relaxed and free exchange of ideas and of moods. Sharon had indeed conceived the university as a self-contained and self-sustained urban structure, a settlement of vibrant academic life, and thus a decisive step up on the scale of modernization. The ornamental image of this university city placed in the forest, particularly as visible in aerial views of the complex, catered to a variety of imaginaries, modernist and traditional, global and local. It was also a campus where most of the student population was supposed to live in residential buildings such as the Fayoye Hall for the men, there was one for the women too, the Moremi Hall. But with a steady increase in student numbers, even these rather spacious facilities would quickly reach the limits of their capacity in the course of the 1960s. The 1960s in Nigeria weren't peaceful times either, with growing ethnic conflicts and frequent strikes spilling over in the field of academia. Thus, the pastoral vibe that the architecture of the University of Ife emitted should have been, or probably has been, disrupted by student protests at times, although this particular campus history of student politics and activism still waits to be written as far as I can see. I would now like to take you to another post-independence context of educational planning, to the Congo, ruled by Joseph Désiré Mobutu, the leader who was seeking a recours to authenticity in the architectures of the post-colonial state. The new university and other educational buildings and campuses continue to being planned and designed by foreign architects though, although in the case of the Congo, usually not by citizens of the former colonizing country, Belgium, but for instance by the Italian Eugene Palumbo, who worked in Africa from the early 1960s until the end of his career in the early 2000s. Palumbo's Institut Pédagogique National, a multi-part campus complex built on the outskirts of Kinshasa, can be considered an almost literal translation of the human capital discourse that undergirded both developmental and decolonizing projects of nation building. His modernist scheme included a variety of seemingly prototypically designed facilities, from teaching and lecture halls, administrative functions to a student residence, all of which dedicated to the training, education, and accommodation of future teachers, so urgently needed to engender competitiveness on the continental and soon to be global marketplace. Interestingly, in 1962, a year after the Addis Ababa conference, Palumbo had successfully applied for the job of UNESCO architect expert responsible for shaping and supervising the school construction program in the new nation, as architecturalist scholars Johan Lage and Kim de Red recount. During his 8 years with UNESCO, Palumbo was responsible for the design of several educational complexes, ranging from prototype prefabricated structures to be implemented all over the territory to more prestigious buildings such as the Kinshasa Teachers College or the remarkable engineering faculty of the University of Lubumbashi, the first stone which was laid in 1966 by Mobutu himself. Infusing UNESCO's influential ideas about development and education with Mobutu's ethnic nationalist project of Africanist authenticity, Eugenio Palumbo was instrumental in providing a spatio-aesthetic face to his hybrid project of post-independence expansionist educational politics. However, missing in these photographs are the very carriers and transmitters of human capital, the students. With Pedro Monaville's new and excellent book on the Congolese student movement of the 1960s and early 70s, this missing subject of the post-colonial educational landscape of the Congo is amply reconstructed and rehabilitated. Here on the right you see a demonstration of members of a pro-Mobutu leftist militant organization, the CVR, that acted, in Monaville's words, as a radical anti-imperialist organization, drawing much inspiration from the rhetoric and strategies of popular mobilization of the Jeunesse des Mouvements National de la Révolution, the youth branch of the one-party state established in the aftermath of the 1963 revolution in Congo-Brazzaville. End of quote. In 1969, however, tensions between students critical of Mobutu and reminiscent of his precursor Patrice Lumumba that have been building since the early 1960s with repeated upheavals and rebellions escalated catastrophically in the massacre of June 4, 1969, when a student strike was brutally clamped down in Kinshasa by police and secret service, with many deaths and hundreds of arrests. Importantly, the Congolese students in 1969 went on strike and hit the streets because they wanted to voice their anger about changes in the environment of higher education, pertaining to their lives as students on and off campus and to their economic situation. It was, one may say, actually a protest centered on strong disappointments with regards to the promises of the human capital theory. Although he doesn't draw this particular connection, Pedro Monaville's rendition of the situation that resulted in the June 4 massacre is very helpful at this point. He writes, "Students defended a certain vision of education and society in the demands they formulated around their living standards. Against politicians who denounced them as privileged and spoiled, they claimed that intellectual growth and learning required a certain level of comfort. State scholarships allowed them to spend money to buy clothes, books, beer, or presents for friends and family in ways that contributed both to the gendered selves they aimed to project and to the political role they aspired to play." The gendered selves Monaville is pointing at here is a highly male focused idea of the student and the student population and of the future elite. Yet the massification of higher education caused a sharp decline in on-campus living conditions. At Lovanium University, students complained about the cost of food at the cafeteria. And whereas students were supposed to be 1 or 2 per dorm bedroom, some now slept in basement rooms that they had to share with several other students. Anxieties about social status combined with an awareness of worldwide youth rebelliousness to legitimize a rhetoric of radicality. In its first public statement, the Kinshasa Student Circle declared its duty to defend the interests of Congolese students by any means necessary, including revolutionary violence, with the same determination as our comrades from Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. As always, End of quote, Monaville. As always, a clear-cut distinction between political, ideological, and economic motives and concerns is impossible to draw. The radicalization of individual students or larger groups within the student body often originates in apparently larger groups often originates in apparently hard to differentiate modes of. Here I'm lost somewhere. Sorry. Anyways, it's about. I mean, what I want to stress here is that the question where the protest is actually originating, where the riot is coming from is which kind of motives are leading to or causing them is really hard to answer. In most of the cases, it's mostly a kind of quite a hybrid, mixed set of concerns and motives. On June 4 and in the days and weeks that followed, the regime violated and arrested hundreds of students, women students among them. The regime considered the students to be a righteous tribe to be silenced and disciplined. As Monaville writes, Mobutu called students demented and dunes cancre and hammered on about their alleged contacts with Maoist China, the Soviet Union and Congo-Brazzaville, where Mobutu believed students had undergone military training under the supervision of exiled Lumumba's leader Antoine Gizenga. End of quote. Here you see two of the few women students, activists being interviewed in October 1969 after an amnesty by Mobutu. Another target became Benoît Verhaegen, a leftist Belgian historian of the Congo and a lecturer at Lovanium University. As Monaville recounts, in one of his recent talks, Verhaegen had denounced the university as an absurd and useless institution. He had called for a new type of university, freed from pretensions to elitism, open to all, and entirely focused on knowing and transforming the world. Mentioning the French events from the spring of 1968, Verhaegen had shared his belief that students had become the new revolutionary class and that by transforming higher education, they could have a deep impact on Congolese society in its globality. Also in 1969, a radical Manifeste de la Fraternité Prolétarienne des Paysans, Ouvriers, Intellectuels et Étudiants Congolais Conscients et Révolutionnaires found its way to the Paris publisher François Maspero, who published it shortly thereafter, together with a long commentary by the cultural anthropologist Gérard Althab. The anonymous authors of this engaging text of revolutionary Maoist prose envisioned a future Congo ruled by peasants and workers, while placing a strong emphasis on education. Quote, schools and universities would multiply in their utopian future, and they would even teach white imperialists the justice of their movement to help them understand that their Negro is dead, and that the man of the black race is firmly and steadfastly standing. End of quote. In the Global Internationalist 1968, the educational enthusiasm of the Revolutionary Student Collective was an example of how the policies that had transformed educational reform in the direction of human capital theory, development and technocratic modernization yielded in a truly, if frequently purely rhetorical radicalization of pedagogy. The multiplication of universities envisioned here went in the opposite direction of the frantic expansion of higher education that was to be witnessed all over the world. Education for all, the UNESCO slogan, could be understood very differently depending on the respective local notions of education that were launched into action in the political field. The repeated call for the revolution of education, often involving a call for the abolition of the institutions of education altogether, if not this deschooling of society in its entirety, that increased since the second half of the 1960s, although it has been heard of before, was a reaction to the various projects of reform which, again were for the most part a reaction to demographic changes, Cold War dynamics, structural transformations such as the ongoing processes of deindustrialization and automation, but also developments on the level of subjectivity, of popular culture, hedonism and modes of consumption. Long time conceived of and treated as the object of reform, a raw matter of mobilization and activation in the interests of national economies and nation building, a human resource without much rights to the city that was nonetheless expected to behave in the most conformist and obedient ways, privileged as they were for their alleged futures as bourgeois producers and consumers, as knowledge citizens, and thus as self-interested agents of human capital, the students of the 1960s discovered their own agency and started to voice their discontent, their anger and frustration in the face of what they experienced as the reality of authoritarian systems that may promote democratization and reform while leaving untouched the established structures of political and economic power. Sometimes, like in the context of the 1968 critical university movement in Italy, this self-recognition of political agency was dubbed potere studentesco, student power, with a nod to potere operaio, workers' power, and to black power, of course. And like in the graffito on the facade of a modernist building in the city of Trento in northern Italy, a hotbed of student protests around 1968, this newly discovered power was expressed in the direct confrontation with and occupation of the built environment of the university, the very site of presumed reform and change, until recently imposed from above. In conclusion, I would like to return to the issue of student life and student housing that I touched upon earlier in the context of universities in Nigeria and the Congo, for it became not only a major concern for planners, architects and administrators during the educational expansions of the 1960s, but also a topic that immediately affected the student population and their experiences as individuals and collectives. The December 1966 themed issue Living in Universities of the London Journal Architectural Design is one of the many examples for how much the organization, the politics, but also the aesthetics of student accommodation had moved center stage. The spaces of student life were scrutinized intensely and designed meticulously, like in this axiomatic drawing of a student cell in Northampton Hall, a student residency in London, or in these floor plans demonstrating the variabilities of spatial confinement in a Swedish student home. However, there was also a lot of architectural creativity invested in the designs of on-campus dormitories and residences. Progressive leftist architects such as Giancarlo De Carlo took much care in conceiving the student accommodations of the new University of Urbino, as did his British colleague Dennis Laston, who was in charge of one of the most eccentric of the numerous new universities that mushroomed in the UK in the 1960s. His terraced dormitories of the University of East Anglia may serve as another example of how tangibly attention for the issue of student housing had increased. However, predominantly the situation of student housing was seen to be in a state of crisis. Student representatives such as the National Student Union in France sounded the alarm around 1962 when they decried the problem of student accommodation. In France, most of the students in the 1960s lived off campus, but educational and urban planners were interested in moving them into newly built student residencies like the Résidence Universitaire on the brand new campus of Nanterre outside of Paris, which opened in November 1965. For many students, the first years in Nanterre were a time of academic freedom and comfort in modernist surroundings, with relatively low student admissions and a faculty-student ratio unheard of elsewhere. But in early 1967, with student numbers rapidly increasing, seminars and lecture halls overcrowding, and a pressing lack of student rooms in the dormitory buildings, the tensions were rising. The Résidence Universitaire Nanterre quickly became the focus of militant activities on campus, organized in part by the newly founded Residence Association, Harun, which in 1967 had 800 members out of 1,400 residents. Overlooking the Pont de Rouen shantytown on the other side of the Avenue de la République and the Petit Nanterre School of Children from the Bidonville, the dormitory became the scene of events that led to the movement of March 22, 1968. A year before already, on March 29, 1967, 60 students took over one of the buildings of the university campus reserved for the girls to protest against the sexual segregation and already against the pursuits and expulsions of activists. The historian François Crouzet, at the time a professor at the Faculté des Lettres et Sciences Humaines at Nanterre, in 1969 published the article "The Besieged University," one of the best, if certainly not the most objective, accounts of the events on campus between 1966 and 1968. Crouzet wrote that early in 1967, the UNIF, the National Student Union in France, had started a campaign against the regulations and disciplinary bylaws of student centers, especially as regards visiting rights in girls' dormitories. Militants denounced the sexual ghettos which the authorities had established and clamored for the liberty of circulation between girls' and men's dormitories. Eventually, in March 1967, a posse of students occupied one of the girls' dormitories. Dean Pierre Grappin, who had authority over the entire campus, acted. He called in a strong body of police, and the occupied building was evacuated without violent incident. A number of students who had taken an active part in the occupation received a suspended sentence of expulsion from the residence. In fact, however, the situation then worsened. Students who lived on the campus were isolated, had no opportunities for amusement, were depressed by the grim surroundings. Moreover, many of them were from abroad or from the provinces, and some had broken with their families. The residence became then the stronghold of a strange students' underworld where political activism was mixed with sexual promiscuity. And during the next year, 1968, it became the sanctuary of the revolutionary groups where they prepared and stocked their posters and leaflets. Here you see a poster which documents how the question of student housing was considered a broader issue, actually to be connected with housing struggles more generally. Moreover, as Crouzet noted, their members and sympathizers living in the dorms had the enormous strategic advantage of being on the spot, only 300 yards from the university buildings and ready to rush there at any time. This is a photograph showing a protest in one of the faculty buildings demanding the free circulation between sexes and their dwellings, that is. A leading activist of the Student Residents Association, Harun, was Dominique Tabar. Here with her sister Beatrice in an interview with French television, that was ORTF, that was filmed in the women's dormitory and broadcasted on March 26, 1968. The two women are asked about their understanding of revolt and revolution respectively, and they leave no doubt that they aim at overthrowing the existing system, that they want to, quote, change the maximum of things in the structure, not only a change of the economy, but an ideological change. Dominique Tabar speaks about her work at the residency, her attempts at integrating the students in a social milieu as one way of creating a form of social life that is otherwise absent from the experience of the university around 1967-68. In many ways, Tabar's engagement was a quest for sovereignty and agency that was directly opposed to the ideas about sovereignty promoted by human capital theory. In 1968, the same year of the May 68 protests or revolution, Theodor Scholz, one of the key proponents of the school, published an article on the resources of higher education with a subsection pertaining to what he called student sovereignty. I quote, "The key to student sovereignty is the private self-interest of students, which provides the necessary economic rationale. Student self-interest is also sufficient to bring about an efficient allocation of investment resources to education under the following conditions. First, competition in producing educational services along with efficient prices of these services. Second, students acquiring optimal information. Third, an efficient capital market serving students. And four, no social benefits, losses from higher education." Thus, and I would like to finish here, thus the standoff around 1968 was also one between the human capital man and the student population, the damned of Nanterre. It would take place inside and outside of buildings, the purpose and meaning of which was and will be forever determined by those who inhabit it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tom Holert. This was a very intriguing presentation, and I must say, before opening the microphone of my colleague Miguel Jerónimo, a very timely one in a moment when in Portugal the development of process of gentrification in some of the most important cities, and namely universitary cities, are creating huge housing problems, but also in a moment when, in a week when some students in both secondary and higher education in Portugal are occupying high schools and faculties, fighting for against global warming, and trying to mobilize society to that cause. But I'm sure we'll have more chances to discuss your presentation. Without further ado, I'll just open the microphone to Miguel Jerónimo. Miguel, for your comment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon to you all. I must start by thanking the organizers, especially my colleague, Professor Isabel Ferreira da Mota, for inviting me to participate in this session. As a consequence, I was able to enjoy immensely, I must say, Professor Holert's work, the 2 books that I've read, and today appreciate his excellent presentation. So thank you, Professor Holert, from the start. There are many reasons to praise this presentation and the research that supports many of the thought-provoking insights Professor Holert shared with us today. Let me just mention 3. First, I would like to state that only a solid commitment to a truly transdisciplinary and multidimensional approach to a specific subject matter can lead to such a rich and multifaceted, empirically based, and this is important, and analytically sophisticated study of the social, that is to say, of the political and economic, but also cultural, spatial, architectural production of pedagogical environments after the Second World War, more precisely during the 1960s and 1970s. This is a great demonstration of the intellectual benefits we can get from questioning artificial divides between and within our disciplines. But it also shows, by comparison, how sometimes transdisciplinary and interdisciplinarity are just words, buzzwords. Frequently, they are not related to actual knowledge and research produced in different areas of expertise that, in order to move forward, need to cross-fertilize. Not here. This research actually achieves these goals in a clear way. Moreover, this work, this presentation, shows how transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity are not ends in themselves. They are an analytical necessity, a crucial one. They are a precondition for the understanding of complex historical phenomena entailing multiple contexts, multiple actors, multiple dynamics, causes, and effects. How could Professor Holert investigate and understand with minutiae and rigor the diverse motivations, the multiple contexts and dynamics, and the varying and long-standing consequences of the educational reforms and related educational architectural designs of the 1960s and 70s without mastering research about issues such as diverse as the multifaceted challenges brought about by the post-Second World War moment, from demographic issues to economic hardships, from mobility crisis or emancipatory aspirations? Second example, how could he do so without knowing more and a lot about the competing global Cold War modernities, which beside the globalization of violence also propagated dynamics of cultural, technical, and scientific diplomacy across the world? How could he indeed do his own research without assessing and in a sense measuring the seismic effects locally and geopolitically of the sometimes extremely violent trajectories of decolonization? One last example, how could he indeed carry out his wonderful research without understanding changes in paradigms of knowledge production and use regarding numerous areas of expertise in economic thought and policy, in social engineering and planning, in architectural psychology, in cognitive and educational sciences, in public administration, in cybernetics, and many, many others? The answer is relatively easy, even if the process is not, which is he could not do what he wanted to do without being able to read a lot and mobilize a lot of different areas of expertise in order to understand in a more finer and rich way his own subject matter. Because this is not a question of merely offering a wider context to a specific problem, as happens frequently. These aspects were causes, factors, crucial and consequential elements that shaped meaningfully and significantly the subject matter and the study, that is, the educational reformist drive of the 1960s and 70s and its consequences. The proper study of these causes and factors, therefore, enables a finer and more solid understanding of the transformations on educational and pedagogical thinking and related modes of specialization of infrastructural development and architectural design. A second impressive point of Professor Holert's work that I would like to stress today relates to the analytical advantages we can actually get from moving beyond mere national histories and by engaging with other analytical scales and frameworks, intersecting them fruitfully. The historical cases and dynamics and their appreciation are connected, entangled histories. They are associated with international and transnational processes, with the circulation and transfer of ideas, models, paradigms, people, and resources. Although highly localized, as Professor Holert showed through a variety of cases, responding therefore to specific circumstances and possibilities, the learning laboratories were a product of international and transnational dialogues and practices. The role of international organizations in the spread of these experiments, surely with adaptations and through selective appropriations, was crucial. The role of UNESCO, for instance, is particularly revealing, and Professor Holert in his volume, for instance, stressed, and here also noted that particular point. The multidirectional exploitation of what was called modern education, associated as it was with the developmental momentum of the 1960s and 1970s, was one of the facets of UNESCO's role. As Professor Holert states, the UNESCO coordinated, and I'm quoting him, a transnational educational planning, a role that was sometimes hindered by other organizations such as the World Bank, just to give one example. As a consequence, the national histories of educational progressivism and reformism are not enough to understand the diversity of actors and the richness of ideas and projects involved. We need more, and this presentation and the connected research shows abundantly why this is so. A third relevant point I would like to stress: the importance to historicize particular processes that we tend to see as new or recent. Professor Holert's research shows the need to foster what we could call archaeological excavations about the politics and economics of knowledge, about what an author called the pedagogization or educationalization of society and its links with modern bureaucracy and post-industrial economy. And also how we need to understand more in an historical, informed and empirically based way about the social and spatial conditions of knowledge production and transmission. To understand historical genealogies of these topics, but also to evaluate their long-standing effects, including in the present. The economization and commodification of knowledge and education, of what was and is still now called efficient teaching and learning, has an history, and that history needs to be properly understood. Naturally, I would like to conclude with some questions, eager to learn more. I selected three basic points, as I don't want to monopolize the debate. Professor Holert, your masterful work shows how all these processes were shaped by unequal power relations, by processes of racialization or gender differentiation and discriminations, for instance. Given one of my specific interests, I wonder if you could systematize your view regarding the relevance of colonialism and decolonization in the affirmation, but also in the demise of...
understand.
Sorry, there's some kind of noise, it's not mine.
Miguel, there's some transmission problem. I haven't. The moment you started to ask your questions, there's some noise was coming in. Or is it?
I don't know.
Am I the only one who is?
I think I heard something, but I think it's over now. I'm not sure.
At least it has nothing to do with me. I'm pretty sure.
No. It's probably. I mean, I have a very. I think it's now better now. Yeah. Could you please begin with your first question? That would be great.
Of course. I wonder if you could systematize your view about the relevance of colonialism and decolonization, not only in the affirmation, but also in the demise of the educational utopias of the 1960s and the 1970s. First of all, I would like to ask you if you came across continuities between colonial and post-colonial moments of educational reformism. That is the continuation of languages, repertoires, but also spaces of reformism. One of the reasons I ask you this is because these languages, repertoires, and space of reformism, including regarding education and well-being, were already being imagined and sometimes enacted in what we call late colonialism in the 1950s. This was particularly clear in inter-imperial institutions such as the Commission for Technical Cooperation south of the Sahara that since the late 1940s debated a lot on how to reform the colonial project. And one of the fundamental elements of this reform was precisely education and naturally as well the spaces of education. For example, the 1961 Addis Ababa conference that you've mentioned was just one example in early 1960s of a series of meetings devoted to rethink education in so-called underdeveloped territories, which were gradually basically ceasing to be colonies formally and becoming independent societies. At the same time, you can argue that what you notice in the Congo, in independent Congo, was in many ways the prolongation of efforts made by the late colonial reformism by the Belgian authorities, sponsored by the heavy funding and investment connected to the so-called Plan Décennal that basically was the Belgian version of the colonial development plans of the British and the French in the case of the French, the Fidesz program since the late 1940s. So racialization was still there, limits to universalism in pedagogy continued, but a consequential intersection between educational reform and developmental drives, social and economic, gained momentum, although in a rather circumscribed way from a social point of view. There were clear continuities, and I would like to hear you a little bit more about these continuities if possible. Second, I would like to hear your thoughts about what in your field and in others as well has been the emphasis on tropical modernism as one of the main features of late colonialism and also the early colonial situation. And I wonder if you could give us your opinion about what this emphasis leaves out, to what extent, if we continue to highlight and emphasize taking as being completely representative of the late colonial phase and the early post-colonial phase, what are we not actually seeing if we focus on these examples of modernist framing of education, of not only at the university level, by the way. So how representative were the examples that you offered us today? And at the same time, can't we locate spaces and logics of radical pedagogy and learning in less modernized environments, in less architecturally designed spaces? My final question, perhaps the most important, and Louise already hinted at some of the points, is about, of course, the contemporary resonances of the issues you engaged with. In your book, you state that the current educational condition is marked by obvious forms of economization and commodification, and what you consider to be kind of a consequence of the politics of austerity, debt regimes, segregation, continued segregation, by the way, what you call neoliberal managerialism, and also an expression that a lot of us embrace, although some with more reasons to do so than others, the fetishization of outcomes within university. Do you see a way of mitigating these tendencies? Do you see a way of, kind of impede the constant ruination of universities? And if so, do you think that the models of the 1970s are useful? And if so, how? To mitigate this seemingly unstoppable process of ruination of our universities. Thank you all for your time, and thank you, Professor Holert, for so many thought-provoking questions and so many compelling insights. Thank you.